Great to see all three of you guys.
Great to see you as well, Chris.
Rabbi and I are under tornado warnings right now in Atlanta for the next, well, I guess technically we're out of it right now, but we had tornado warnings and our phones were going crazy. I'm sure yours was too, right, Rabbi?
Yeah, it has passed, I believe.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Crazy weather we're having.
Looks like they texted that we're good to go, green light.
Oh, great. Excellent. Okay. Well, great. Well, then let's begin. So good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Thrasher, and I'm the Director of Substance Use Disorders and Recovery at the Clinton Foundation. And I'd like to first thank the organizers of the CCSA conference, as well as the leadership of Penn State University. I think that it needs to be said that when a university really supports this type of effort, it says a lot. This type of conference should really challenge, I think, all of us to do our part in addressing this epidemic. And over the last 3+ years at the Clinton Foundation, we have worked with faith leaders from across the country to address this epidemic together. And so why is working with faith leaders so important? Well, I would suggest to you that Sunday, or actually whatever day you choose to worship as part of your faith tradition, is still in a sense the most segregated day of the week. And I think that this reality really provides both a challenge and an opportunity for those of us that work in substance use disorders to equip our faith leaders with the tools, the skills, and perhaps most importantly, the confidence that they need to address this crisis in a way that only faith leaders can do. You know, I know that there's a real hesitation for people to seek help when they're struggling with a substance use disorder. But I think it's important for faith leaders to take the initiative, you know, when it's possible, because of the central role that they really can and do play in their communities. But all too often what we hear from faith leaders is we lack a language from the pulpit and even beyond to talk about these issues. Here's what we know. We know that more than 1/3 of Americans attend religious services on a weekly basis. And individuals turn to their faith leaders in times of crisis. You know, I often say that our faith leaders are in this, what I would say, in a sense, is like a long-term relationship with many of their congregants. And that really enables them to detect, you know, the signs of distress and intervene, but only if they really feel, you know, confident and capable to do so. And, you know, faith leaders have this ability to, you know, educate, to motivate, to mobilize. They enlighten, you know, they equip, and they really engage with their communities in a way that isn't done, you know, with, you know, public health. But in order to do so, they need to know the programs that are in their communities, that are available to build the community's capacity together. And that's where I think all of us can come in and really help, because connecting and collaborating is what it's really all about. We want to inform, we want to strengthen faith leaders' efforts, because here's what we know at the Clinton Foundation. You know, we didn't come up with this, but it certainly is true. And that is that 1 + 1 + 1 is far greater than 3. And, you know, faith leaders, they have this ability to sort of foster change and shape and influence and inform the attitudes that so often I know contribute to inequities. You know, their ability to change the mindset of folks that addiction is not a moral failing, but it's a treatable disease, I think is going to be the key to fighting and ultimately beating this epidemic. So how do we do this work? Well, I think that we do this work using or utilizing 3 principles, and many of them would say are spiritual in nature. The first one is honesty. And the honesty part of this, I think, is the reality that this epidemic affects all of us. It cuts across all demographics, you know, regardless of our age, our race, our sexual identity, our socioeconomic status, you know, our creed, our faith tradition, or even lack of a faith tradition. We are all affected by substance use disorders in some way. So honesty is going to be key. The second principle, I think, is open-mindedness. As we work together, it's going to require all of us, you know, really using a multi-pronged approach, which means that none of us have the magic bullet. You know, none of us have the answers, but all of us together, the collective we, the informed we, the confident we, and the ability to think outside the box in unconventional ways in order to save lives, that's open-mindedness. And finally, willingness. I think we need leaders that care enough about this, you know, that know enough, which is, I think, where all of us come in to work together, and are willing to do enough and will persevere until the job is done. That having been said, you know, leadership is too important to leave its emergence to chance alone. And we know that leadership responds to opportunities, to challenges, to crises. We also know that leadership is a team sport, you know, and as a team sport, you know, it's really not position dependent, right? All of us are leaders. I often think about leadership like a relay race. And as a leader, you know, the question is, do you know when it's your time to pass the baton? Because if we know when to ask for help, effective leadership can and will transform communities. So all that to say, it's my honor and privilege to now introduce you to 3 leaders that have joined me today to share with all of us their hope, their strength, and their experience. All of these leaders have been through our program, but we're doing this work before we came along and continue to do this work after they've gone through our program. And I'm going to introduce you to all of them, and then we're going to do a deep dive into some of these topics that I brought up. So our first, in no particular order, is Rabbi Eliyahu Schusterman, who is the founder and director of Chabad Intown, which is here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I currently reside. Chabad Intown is a Jewish outreach organization in Atlanta. And Rabbi Schusterman is also the founder and director of Jeff's Place, which is a center dedicated to decreasing stigma through education and programs focused on awareness and support for the Jewish community who have found recovery, as well as those who are still struggling with a substance use disorder. So welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Reverend Melissa Maher, and Reverend Melissa is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church serving at Mercy Street, which is a church located in Houston, Texas, for the spiritual rather than the religious. Mercy Street creates a safe harbor of hope and transformation for those in recovery from life. And I love the last sentence of her brief bio, and it could not be more appropriate than today. The last sentence in her bio says, Mercy Street believes that whether you've been to Penn State or the state Penn, please come as you are. How ironic that we are at Penn State today talking about substance use disorders. So welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, Chris.
And our third and final panelist is Imam Dr. Basim Hameed, who is a member of the Islamic Society of Greater Houston and the Imam of Shadow Creek Muslim Community Center. Now, additionally, Dr. Hameed is a practicing neurologist in Houston and runs his own clinic. It's called the Inova Pain Center. Imam Hameed is also the president and founder of the Wasat Institute, a Houston-based nonprofit focused on building and strengthening communities through a focus on health and wellness. So, welcome, Dr. Hameed.
Thank you, Chris.
And we're going to jump right into this. And, you know, as I stated earlier, faith leaders and policymakers and those who help to shape policy, as I said, have this unique ability, right, to foster change, to inform the attitudes that contribute to inequities. And I think that there's perhaps no bigger inequity than stigma, you know? And so I'm going to start off with asking all of you to respond to this one, which is, how do we destigmatize addiction, treatment, and recovery so that it's viewed and treated for what it is, which is a medical illness and not a moral failing? And certainly from your perspectives as a faith leader, would love to hear kind of how you work to destigmatize this and drive the message home that this is not a moral failing, but rather a chronic illness. And I'm going to start with, I guess, Melissa, why don't you start?
Thanks, Chris. And a deep appreciation to Penn State. Really enjoyed the first panel this morning. think as far as making space, we talk about in our community creating a safe harbor. That to destigmatize is to first begin to take something out of the silence. And so as a faith community, we do not ask anyone to check their lives at the door and then enter a space to hopefully have a conversation and to encounter God. We want them to bring the fullness of their lives. And so in order to destigmatize, I think there needs to be space within a faith community, just within the language that is used itself, whether that's in a small group, in a corporate worship gathering. For myself as a faith leader, in 2 weeks, I will celebrate 7 years compliant on medication for mental illness. And so to just know that there is a space in order to bring the fullness of our journey into the mystery that is the faith community. Lastly, I'll say as it relates to stigma, because of those in our faith community who have worked a 12-step program or have been on this journey of recovery, there has been a change, I think, sometimes in the power dynamic that we think exists. That as faith leaders, or even those who find themselves in a faith community, that somehow we think we've become experts on anything. So I think to destigmatize is to really empower those within our communities who can teach us the language we need to use. That really opens up a space for people to seek the help, the treatment that they need. So I'm grateful to be here today.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Let's go with Rabbi. Rabbi, how have you worked to destigmatize?
So I want to echo what Melissa said in terms of changing our language. I think that's so important. Not that we're at the top, but we're leaders in our respective communities, so it starts at the top. The stigma comes from the perception that it is, that the person engaging in these behaviors are degenerate or whatnot. I'm dealing with a fellow right now who reached out to me from our community, who's a prominent doctor, and his wife is, she is trying to hide the fact that he is in treatment now. And my heart goes out to her because the journey is an extremely painful one, but at the same time, she needs the support, and she's afraid to reach out for the support because of the perception that in some way her husband is a degenerate as opposed to someone who has a mental illness, who has a disease, and so on. So I think it's changing the language, and it's every single one of us engaging in that, every opportunity we have to articulate clearly and simply that this is a mental illness, this is a treatable disease, and so on and so forth. The other thing is, even those of us that are faith leaders, that are passionate and invested in recovery, we have to prioritize it within our own communities. We whether it's a prayer service or an adult education event or a family event, we naturally gravitate towards those events that are going to bring in the most people, are going to bring in the most revenue. We each have our areas of responsibility. And we have to prioritize this, even if it's on an altruistic basis, to do events and programs around recovery, to really let the community know that this is normal, this is necessary, this is consistent with all of our respective missions, whether it's saving souls or saving lives. They're both consistent in the work of recovery.
So true. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Imam, talk to us from the Muslim tradition. How do you address stigma?
Certainly. First, I would like to thank Penn State for this awesome program. I would like to thank the Clinton Foundation for their initiative and for inviting us as well. I'm so pleased to be here. I think as faith leaders, we shouldn't be dissociated from our congregations. Our congregations are getting more savvy. They're more into science. They're more into social media. And I want to reiterate what Melissa and the Rabbi have mentioned, but also add that especially in our Islamic tradition, we believe that God works in this universe through certain laws. When it comes to diseases like diabetes, there is certain genetic predispositions that would make you predisposed to develop diabetes. For the longest time, we all know that mental illnesses was a stigma, and a lot of people didn't seek treatments. As a Muslim community in the United States, we're still a young community. A lot of our people are immigrants, so it's still a big taboo, actually, and more so when it comes to addiction. So it is very important to use knowledge, use statistics, and convince people that this is a disease. We need to speak the same language. Addiction is not it's not a choice that a person can make. It's not a moral failure. You do not have a choice how the genetic makeup that you ended with is. You do not choose your parents, you do not choose your genes. And this is an important message that would reassure everyone. It's actually going to work for preventative and interventional. For people who are not addicted, we need to warn them that you might be predisposed for addiction, so better not to get engaged or involved in risky behaviors. And for those who are addicts, we need to reassure them that it is not a bad choice they've made. This is the genetic makeup they ended up with, and we need to help them to overcome this, because there is also the other part, which is the environmental interface with the genes, and that is the modifiable aspect of their lives. They cannot reselect their genes. Well, I guess in the future you might be able to change your genes, but as of now, we're not able to change our genes. But there are other factors in the environment we can change. So by reassuring everyone that this is predisposition that you're born with, and we need to emphasize on the impact of the environmental factors, I think we can destigmatize this whole process and treat it exactly as any other disease like diabetes, like obesity, like mental illnesses, which are curable or at least can be put under control.
You know, you bring up such an important point, Imam. I've had the opportunity to visit all three of your houses of worship while I have been traveling, and certainly with Chabad Intown, it's right across town from me. I want to do a bit of a deeper dive because of something that Imam said, and I'd like Rabbi and Reverend to respond to this. And that is I don't want to just leave stigma quite yet. I've had the opportunity to go to Mercy Street. I've seen it in front of me. I've seen the people. I've seen the energy. I've seen the enthusiasm. I've been to Chabad Intown. I've been to Jeff's place. I know that both of you are doing things bigger than just your house of worship. How, and address this specifically from your faith tradition. As, you know, an elder in the Methodist tradition, Melissa, you are located, literally physically located almost across the hall from the house of worship that would be considered more, what's the word? Traditional, maybe. Talk to us a little bit about the non-traditional approach that Mercy Street is, so they understand, the viewers understand what Mercy Street really is. And the same thing with the Chabad Intown. You know, Rabbi, you've done this work walking the Jewish community through the 12 steps. I mean, it's so appropriate. And then after that, Imam, what you were able to do the day before the drug take back with getting over 30 mosques to participate. I want you all to be able to talk a little bit about that. So let's start with Melissa.
So the tradition that I'm a part of, Methodism, don't worry, I recognize in giving a preacher time that I can begin to nerd out over our own tradition and story. But I think this part of the story is important. Within the tradition that I'm a part of, there was an interdisciplinary approach from the very beginning. Some of the founders of the Methodist movement came out of the Anglican Church in England and really began to take the life and the expression of the church into the city, into the eastern parts of London, to begin to go into the coal mines. And so a part of our tradition is this interdisciplinary nature of being a faith community, that we are not just a faith community that meets and is insulated or isolated from what's going on in the city in which we are placed. And so Mercy Street is 24 years old. We are a part of a mainline denomination that's been around for 75 years. But we began in the late 90s when this movement within the recovery community was beginning to emphasize, to de-emphasize the anonymous part of their nature, which is to be open about the disease of addiction, to begin to help change some of the language. And to really, I would say the life of our faith community takes place. We meet on Saturday nights at 5:30, intentionally so. That middle part of the weekend when all of our stinking thinking begins to return after a long week, to create this ritualized opportunity to practice our faith. But a lot of our work, a lot of our conversations take place within treatment centers, inside and outside the walls of the prisons, corporate boardrooms, because the disease of addiction knows no particular zip code or socio or economic class. And so we draw upon this tradition that we think it is critically important for the faith community to work hand in hand with what's going on within the larger city. And the last thing I would say as it relates to stigma, and Chris, I hope I'm answering the question as you posed it. I am deeply grateful to researchers like Robert Putnam out of Harvard, who has done work around isolation and the importance of social capital and how we need to build social capital with one another. Researchers out of the University of London who talk about church and faith communities as places of spiritual capital, and that we need to be bringing together and bridging these networks of the incredible assets or resources that we have within the city. And so I think that just comes out of our tradition within the Methodist tradition and all of its imperfections as well, that we want to build these bridges to not only reduce stigma, but to really create these robust networks of healing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melissa. Spot on. And thanks for sharing a bit about not only the Methodist tradition, but Mercy Street. Rabbi, for those who might not be considered with the Chabad tradition, can you share a little bit about that in the context of the question that I asked, which is, how you sort of navigate this from the Jewish faith?
Sure. So I'll comment both as specifically as it relates to Chabad and to the broader Jewish leadership. I want to say something first in the negative and then in the positive, because I think it's important to understand the stage in which we are all operating. So Chabad specifically, we are a Jewish outreach organization that has 5,000 centers worldwide. So in terms of a distribution mechanism, you've got 5,000 plus rabbis and rebbitzins, rabbis and their wives around the world who interact with their local communities in a way that is just, the reach is far and wide. The negative, as it relates to Chabad and as it relates to rabbis across denominations, is that we're very much focused on our communities, our respective communities. And life is busy and there are all kinds of demands on our time. And we just generally do not appreciate, number one, how deep and far spread the issue of addiction is today, substance use abuse, how far wide it goes, and how it's increasing. We just don't realize it. And it's kind of like when that one individual comes to us, it's like they are the exclusion to the rule simply because we don't know that every other person, every third person is dealing with something, is engaged in something and needs the help. So that's the negative. The positive, though, is that, and this was really what, despite the specifics around Jeff himself, who was a participant in our programming, and we were not aware that he was in recovery, and then he was found having passed from a relapse, which triggered all of us in a way that really touched us very deeply in our hearts. But even before that, I had the opportunity to be present when Rabbi Shais Taub, who's the author of God of Our Understanding, a book on Jewish perspective on recovery, when he was explaining what recovery was, I was really ignorant of it, and I happened to have a connection to a particular foundation, and he asked me to somebody from the foundation asked me to bring him there for a sit down. And what he said just really blew my mind, and that was that essentially addiction is a spiritual malady, and its method of recovery is a spiritual pathway. I mean, we don't have to get more philosophical than that. That's what it is. And that's the business that we're in. We're in the business of spirituality. So if we can just educate our faith leaders in the Jewish community that this is not it's not a medical thing. Yes, there are all these other elements but at its core, it's a spiritual malady that needs a spiritual pathway for recovery. We're the spiritual doctors. You know, we have the tools to help people on that path, and we're equipped to do that. I'll say two final things. One is one of my favorite verses in the Torah comes from Isaiah, where the prophet talks about the Messianic era, and he says, "Va'atem tuluktu echad echad," and you will gather them one by one. And I believe that the only way to heal this problem is one by one. It's not. No marketing campaigns are going to do the trick. It's each faith leader connecting with another faith leader, explaining the value of this, and really connecting that. And the last thing I'll say is, there was a great rabbi who passed away a few months ago, Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky. He was in recovery himself, although he said he was in recovery not for a substance abuse, but anger associated with ego. But he was a leader in Jewish recovery. He wrote over 90 books on psychology and healing and health and so on. He said that he was a rabbi first, and then he became a therapist. And they asked him why he became a therapist, and he said it used to be that when people had struggles in their lives, they would go to their faith leaders. And then the world of therapy evolved, and people stopped going to their faith leaders to address their emotional, spiritual needs. They won't go to therapists. So he said, look, if they're already going to therapists, they might as well go to a therapist who's a rabbi. But I think the story is so telling that we are spiritual doctors, and that's why people do come to us, and we need to be equipped to know that we do have the answers for them. We can help them onto a road of recovery. We can be their spiritual guide. I hope that's helpful.
That's incredibly helpful. And statistically speaking, we know that individuals turn to their faith leaders or spiritual advisors more than their physicians, more than their friends, more than their family members. And too often, our faith leaders are ill-prepared to deal with this. So thank you so much, Rabbi, for kind of shining a spotlight on that. Very meaningful. Imam, you pulled off something that I am still blown away by. The day before the annual drug take back, you got over 30 mosques throughout Houston to address addiction. Talk to us. I mean, it's from the outside, addiction is so stigmatized in the Muslim community, but you've been able to break that stigma down. Tell us a little bit about how you did that.
Certainly. I believe exactly in what the rabbi has mentioned, providing education and providing the tools. And the education can be implicit and explicit. And one of the most creative actually methods and tools that I was able to use is the drug take back day. To be honest, I didn't know this event existed before. I was involved with the Clinton Foundation initiative, and thanks for introducing this tool to us. This drug take back day by itself serves as a very indirect, passive, non-threatening way of educating people, destigmatization, and raising awareness. Because as you've seen, you visited our sites, when you have these boxes, when you have the DEA agents collecting the medications, people would ask, why are we doing this? And then you start talking to them like, do you know that we have more than 70,000 people like died of overdose last year? It's like, wow. And that by itself would make him think. As part of that event, actually, the idea came, why don't we have all the mosques in Houston talk about this event and make it an introduction to the opioids epidemic, to the drug overdose epidemic, and educate people about it? In the beginning, there was some resistance, honestly, because as you mentioned, oh, we don't have this in the Muslim community. But people were shocked, actually, that we do. And the imams would share stories with me, like, you can't imagine how many people walked to me and opened up and started seeking help. Then digging deeper into the Muslim community, actually, now we have some research actually that talks about the drug addiction, and shockingly, the engagement in risky behaviors in Muslim youth is very similar to the larger community, to the larger society. Over 50% try certain drugs when they're in college years. The majority of them start when they're younger than 17, actually. Very similar statistics to what you have in the larger society. So the imams actually started educating themselves more. And as people come and walk to them, talking to them about their problems, we started seeing more interest, actually. And this became as a staple. Every drug take back day, we have it part of the curriculum, that people talk about drugs, talk about the epidemic. And there was some disruption during the COVID pandemic, obviously, but I think we're back gradually on track where people are addressing this issue more and more. Many mosques actually were more proactive and started dedicating a whole day like workshop, for the youth on prevention and intervention, talking about drugs. And I can tell you, before we started this initiative, this was a big taboo. This was a big stigma. Now, people talk about it freely. People are comfortable. And I can tell you that many, many people actually have come to me seeking help, and we were able to guide them through the resource guide that we were able to put together in Houston, as you remember, that resource guide on for addiction. And I encourage everyone, actually, if they have not been involved with the drug take back day, be part of it when it's back and educate your congregations about it. And that would serve a very, very non-threatening way of destigmatization and providing education and raising awareness.
Thanks so much, Imam. You reminded me, 2 years ago, the number was 72,000. The preliminary data that's come back from the CDC most recently is we are at 92,000 for a 12-month period. And that number is going to go up when the final numbers come in for the lives lost in 2020. I think we're going to be over 100,000 lives. We'll see. Think about that, Penn State. The Nittany Lion Stadium is about 106,000. Think about the Nittany Lion Stadium being just about packed to the rafters, and every single one of those people being dead within a year from a drug overdose. That's the type of numbers we're talking about. I'm gonna shift. I have a bunch of questions, and we have like 12 minutes left, and we've gotten through one question so far, because you guys all have amazing things to say, and I want to shift to the whole science versus faith sort of conversation, because I think that, you know, we're dealing with sort of harm elimination versus harm reduction when we're dealing with science and faith around substance use disorders, especially with that coming from faith traditions. Because whenever there's a public health kind of epidemic, and we can look to the history like HIV, AIDS, you know, needle exchange. Remember how we you know, and sexual health, obesity, you know, whenever we have those types of epidemics where there's an implied choice, you know, if you don't eat that cupcake, you won't be obese. You know, if you keep your pants zipped, she can't get pregnant. You know, whenever this is implied choice, well, just change what you're doing and it'll be okay. The whole faith versus science debate question is front and center. I would love to hear from your perspective how, because see, in public health science, we know that there's vast interpretive viewpoints of science, meaning that myself and another academic can read the exact same study and get a completely different meaning out of it. And it happens in faith too. We call it hermeneutics. You guys can read the same scripture and interpret it completely differently. How do you all, from the perspective of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faith traditions, handle the science piece of it? Are you informed by science? If not, how do you deal with it? What if the science is completely inconsistent with scripture? How do you handle that? Let's start with Rabbi.
So fundamentally, I would say in any mainstream faith, but I can speak, you know, from a Jewish perspective, we take science into consideration. We rarely find that science contradicts the scripture. It's more often that science may have a different philosophical understanding of something. But once we get out of the book philosophy, the hermeneutics, the question is, what actually needs to happen on the ground? So when we talk about, you know, take back the drug day, clean needles and stuff like that, I'm not the scientist, and I'm going to let the scientists do what they need to help the world from that angle. And I support it. I support every aspect of it. I support those that are into harm reduction and those that are in support of harm. I'm in support of those that are into harm elimination. I think there's a place for everything, and the facts on the ground, the science on the ground will ultimately, as time evolves, determine which is the better or are both necessary. Practically speaking, where do I live? I live not in that part of the world. I live in the part of the world where there are people who are uninformed about addiction altogether, and then people that are struggling that need help. And that's where I come in. That's where most faith leaders come in that are dealing with a congregation or a specific community. You know, maybe at a higher level, there are those that carry responsibility to think about the future of the universe and the future of humanity. For us, it's the individuals in our immediate circle. And when it comes to that, to me, the gold standard is the 12-step program. And that's where it becomes about saying, hey, yes, you need that miracle, but the miracle starts when you do your part, follow the program, work the steps, believe in God. He's going to help you through this. But that science doesn't factor in there. In fact, it's in a sense, where I would say is it's the merge of science and faith, especially when it comes to the 12 steps, because we all know you need a miracle, you need God's grace in order to get onto the path of recovery. But at the same time, the science says you got to do the heavy lifting. If you do the heavy lifting, you'll get your miracle, but you got to do your part. So I think that's where I live, and that's where I am actually qualified to give an opinion to whatever extent I'm qualified.
You know, Rabbi, you remind me of a saying for those of us in long-term recovery, and the saying says, if we don't go within, we go without. And so you touched on that. I appreciate that. Imam, same question. how do you navigate this world of faith and science?
I think it is very important to incorporate science and faith now, because we know actually, if you look at the map, we are all losing to no faith or to atheism. I respect everyone and whatever they believe, but as a faith community, there is a shrinkage actually in the number of followers of faith traditions, and losing to atheism. Part of that actually is because not implementing scientific data, not incorporating science and make it merry faith. And from Islamic point of view, my job is a little bit easier because I think, faith encourages to follow science actually. And it says there shall be no contradiction between science and faith principles. So I always, especially with me being a doctor, I always like to bring the scientific data and use it from faith point of view to encourage people. This is what we've talked about before when it came to stigma, to tell them that it is not a choice you've made. You're not in moral failure. This is the genetic makeup that you were gifted with, so it is not your fault. But at the same time, there is a heavy lifting you have to do. And I see this approach very comforting to people because they feel, number one, it takes the burden of guilt actually off of their souls. They don't feel like, I'm done, I'm at a point of no return, but they feel that, yeah, it does make sense. And then I can change this because I am not distant to this 100%. There is the environmental aspect of it that is modifiable and that could be changed. This is the preventative and the interventional aspect of the treatment of addiction. And again, we go back to the 12-step program, which is the standard approach to treating addiction. It has the spiritual component, but it has the practical component as well, which is you have to be proactive. You have to take the first step out of these 12 steps, basically. So again, I think it's very important for us faith leaders to marry faith and science and use a combined approach in order, number one, to help people with addictions, but more importantly and widely, not to lose the believers for no faith, basically.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. It's been an issue that I have been deeply engaged in for many, many years, this whole idea of faith and science. I'll talk about it more in one more second, but Melissa, I want the same question from the Christian and the Methodist tradition. How do you navigate that world of faith and science, especially if they're not consistent with, scripture?
Sure. I think faith and science are gifts to one another because though there may be evidence base in both, there's an element of mystery that comes even within the world of science and within the world of faith. I think far too often in the Christian tradition, our track record has caused harm in this conversation around faith and science, of demanding for our sacred scripture of the Bible, demanding that it's trying to answer questions of science when it's not, and interpreting language on one another. And so I think faith and science are beautiful kind of conversation partners that need to be able to challenge and sharpen one another. And there's space for both. I think as, Christianity as an institution, Imam Basim was alluding to this. As a faith leader, I'm critically aware that the institution that I'm a part of is changing and shifting, and if you began to look at it within the 12 steps, that the way that we have practiced our faith has become unmanageable. And so even moving into this space of your comments in the beginning of openness, of willingness, and being able to, I think, look to the resources that we have within science to guide us. And at the same time, to not completely abdicate our role. Spiritual doctors, as the rabbi said, is a privilege and authority that we've studied to have, and also need to bring an element of really critical thinking, and to not play the mystery card too soon. I'll finish by saying this. I think as an institution, Christianity, to be a vibrant expression of what God is doing in the world, we are no longer places of morality and accountability. We are the places of storytelling, of meaning making, of finding hope. And to do so, we can draw upon numerous resources. And so within our Christian tradition, within the Methodist tradition, I want to be a leader who's engaged in this robust conversation. And so for the work of Penn State to offer this space that you have, I've been taking notes in the first session of practices and network theories that we can bring into our institution. So thanks again.
Thank you. I'm going to provide a shameless plug here, because that conversation that we just had around science and faith will continue tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern time. We are having a 60-minute conversation around the intersection of faith and science. President Clinton will open the conference tomorrow at 3 p.m. and sort of talk about the importance of bringing these worlds of faith and science together. And then CNN's Sanjay Gupta will be the moderator, and he will talk to a prominent public health scientist, which happens to be the former US Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher, who served under both Presidents Clinton and Bush, along with the Bishop of the United States AME faith tradition, Bishop Vashti McKenzie. And so Sanjay will moderate a conversation between a prominent faith leader and a public health scientist in the context of culture, race, and ethnicity, and how culture, race, and ethnicity impacts faith and science and substance use disorders. So we will put the link for that in the chat box if you'd like to attend tomorrow at 3 p.m. Thank you to the three of you all again for coming in and sharing your hope, your strength, and experience. And once again, thank you to Penn State University for putting this on, and all the folks that made the CCSA possible. It is so deeply meaningful to us and the work that we do, and we are so happy and proud to call you all partners in our efforts. So thanks for everyone coming out and listening in, and we will turn it back over to Penn State for, I think, what it will be a quick coffee break and then another session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.